Welcome back to another rapid review with the Gifted Academics team. Instructor for the day, that'd be me, going over the CISSN exam, specifically Chapter 10. So Chapter 10 is all about nutritional assessment and counseling for your athletes. So the first, I would say, big appearance in the textbook that we see of actually working with individuals, offering some assessment and some counseling. So if you have the slides in front of you, if you have already signed up, you're just using this as additional review resource. Fantastic. That's super smart. If you found this video randomly, welcome. Look at the links down below. We've got plenty of prep resources to fit your needs, no matter where you are in your career. Self-led prep, instructor-led prep, add-ons, doesn't matter. We've got what you need. Link is in the description. All right, slide 2 is where we are. If you have the slides in front of you. If you don't have the slides in front of you, lucky enough, Jake, our fantastic editor, comments down below for Jake. Jake, we love you. Comments for Jake. He'll put slide 2 up on the screen for you. So we're going to talk about the nutrition assessment, the basics. So this is step 1. An athlete comes into your door, zero background whatsoever of working with them. You start the same place you would start if you were writing a training program. So if you've taken like the CSCS or the TSAC, or maybe even, like the ACSM or the NASM CPT, you know that when working with an individual, the place that you start, step number 1, is your needs analysis. We can't set goals. We can't write a program. We can't write macros, a diet, calories, anything like that without first starting with that needs analysis. So the same thing is true over on the nutrition side. They simply call it, at the ISSN with their CISSN exam, they simply call it the nutritional assessment for athletes. So instead of a needs analysis, it's more of an assessment. So let's follow the flow chart here. I think they did a really good job of providing a flow chart that makes the most sense when working with athletes. And number 1, the place where you start is your basic assessment. And that basic assessment is going to be about the individual, starting with the individual. We have to start there. We can't talk about the sport. We can't talk about the activity. We can't talk about goals. We can't talk about macros, blood work, special populations, any of that until we first start with the basics, anthropometry. How tall are you? How much do you weigh? What's your body fat percentage? Everything that goes into the basic metrics of this individual's body. We're going to utilize those numbers to calculate everything that follows. Calories, carbohydrates, protein intake, specific supplements that they might need, assessment of blood work. We have to start with the anthropometry. That is step number 1 in your flow chart. You can see that at the top here. They've got that as a weight analysis, eating and lifestyle patterns. Kind of gets into step 2 there for me. Fitness and lab tests, and then psychosocial influences. So in that first nutrition assessment, I like to say step 1 is anthropometry. Step 2 is going to be their current food intake and their eating habits. So what foods do they like? What time of day do they like to eat at? Are they eating before practice, after practice? Are they doing long endurance style events where they even need intra-workout nutrition? What does their nutrition currently look like? What is their background in nutrition? What do they know currently about the basics of fueling their body? The analogy that I always use is if someone comes to you and they think that Mountain Dew and a Slim Jim is a good breakfast, you're really at square one when it comes to quote unquote healthy, productive, performance enhancing nutrition with this individual. Whereas if someone comes to you and they say, I eat 4 meals a day, I spread my protein out, I try and go for low glycemic carbohydrates before practice, after I go with, a higher glycemic, that's an individual who has some very, very advanced eating habits. So you may be able to skip along some steps to move that at a faster pace. But that goes into what are you eating right now and what are your eating habits? A little bit of knowledge in there of what they actually know, their baseline information that they have, what they've gleaned over time as an athlete, as an individual about nutrition. Step number 3, now we're getting into the biochemical. That biochemical is going to be blood work and any physician's diagnosis or diagnoses. So we'll look at blood work. We'll look at things like, fasting insulin, HbA1c, blood glucose. What are their lipids? What's their cholesterol? Is there anything that stands out on the blood work? Or do they have any diagnosis from a physician that would alter what their eating patterns need to be? If they have an athlete come in, they're a type 1 diabetic, the nutrition plan that you're going to write, or the nutrition plan that you're going to work with a registered dietitian on to write for the individual, looks a lot different than another athlete in terms of a glucose control, making sure we're balancing those hyperglycemic episodes, especially as you throw in exercise. So step number 3 oftentimes can be pretty quick. We look at the blood work, everything looks good, physician's diagnosis, nothing, completely cleared for exercise. Okay, we're good to go. But this is a vital step, because if you skip over this, you might start them on an example here, a fat loss diet. They're not losing fat the way that you want. The weight just doesn't seem to be coming off. And then you're like, okay, let's go and get some blood work. You get the blood work done, and there's some issue with their metabolism. They're hypothyroid. Had we started with the blood work and a physician's diagnosis, we could have saved a lot of time in terms of fixing that issue before moving into any specific diet for the individual. So usually a quick step, but an important one right there, number 3, with that biochemical analysis. Number 4, what does the research say about any special considerations? So population-specific needs and clinical studies around those individuals. So we kind of already talked about the special pops, type 1 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, all of these conditions that an individual can be suffering from that will dictate what their nutritional needs actually are in that moment and, planning out longer term. But what about population specific? What about endurance athletes versus strength athletes? How does a fat loss diet, we already used fat loss, how does a muscle gain diet change for an individual who's an endurance athlete running 30, 40 miles a week versus an Olympic weightlifter who's training 5 sessions a week for an hour a day? How do those nutrition plans differ, and what does the research actually say? What do the clinical studies actually say? A lot of that research is summarized in this text as a whole, especially as we get into more of the applied chapters. But this is a good place to start, especially if you're working with a population that you haven't seen in the past. So, your background is you've been a strength conditioning coach for men's football and women's soccer. All of a sudden, the sports nutritionist takes a leave, and you step into that role, and now you're working with every athlete. You're seeing endurance athletes, you're seeing cross country, you're seeing pole vault, you're seeing basketball, you're seeing soccer, field hockey. It's not a bad idea just to take a step back and educate yourself. What do these clinical studies actually say in terms of maximizing performance within specific populations? Those populations can be athletes, they can be specific individuals, and like we talked about, special populations as well. Last but not least, physical performance needs. What do these individuals actually need to perform at their best on a day-to-day basis? This is usually where people start. People will look at, okay, I'm working with athletes. I've got a football player in front of me, and they'll say, okay, what are the nutritional needs for a football player? And they'll just get super bogged down and unable to actually solve problems because they didn't start where they should have, which is the individual. We start with the individual, and that person is a football player. They are a soccer player. She is a field hockey athlete. So we always have to start with the individual, work our way through up to the sport. But people often flip that. They say, I'm a sports nutritionist. The sport is the most important part here. Wrong. It's always the individual when we start with that needs analysis. So height, weight, body fat, what are they currently eating? What does their blood work look like? Are there any specific needs for that population according to the research? Then we can say, okay, what does the sport look like? What are the bioenergetic needs? What's the training volume? What's the season that we're in? Now we can have a conversation about that specific sport. When we look at the flow chart again, kind of yapped a lot there. Let's go back to the flow chart on the slide. We can see training program and competitive events are differentiated out there. So when we look at that, we can see over on the training program, the training side of things, type of sport, training routine, energy systems being utilized, musculoskeletal stresses, thermoregulatory, are there any weight changes, and then changes that could happen on the nutritional side. So the super basics, energy need, calories, carbohydrates, protein, fluids, vitamins, and minerals. So we need to set up a nutritional plan around the training program, which optimizes performance in training and facilitates and fuels adaptation long term. Remember, the reason that we train is to get better. So the nutrition around training needs to fuel and facilitate the adaptation process, recovery and then adaptation, so that we get better in training. That differs from competitive events, because if we think about a competitive event, we're not really training. We're not super worried about recovery. We're not super worried about adaptation. What are we focused on in competition? Easy enough, winning or performing at our best. Those two tend to go hand in hand. So when we look at the physiological demands over there, they're the same. When we look at the nutritional needs, they're the same. But what we're trying to get out of those and the manipulations that we make based on nutrition are going to change. Let me give you an example. On the training side, let's say you've got an American football player. He came into training camp at 370 pounds. This is an individual that for the season needs to be at 330 pounds. So we need roughly a 40-pound weight loss for this individual to be performing at their best. Maybe it's written into their contract, something like that. When this individual is training, there will be a calorie deficit to facilitate that weight loss. That calorie deficit won't be so large that it eats into recovery capacity or the ability to perform within practice, but it's still going to exist. Now, when we move over to a competitive event, because we are trying to perform well within that specific event, we are not going to worry so much about calorie intake. So for that day or that series of days or leading up to that event, we may bring calories up to maintenance or just above, pushing fat loss to the back burner for now so that we can perform as well as we can in that competitive event. So we call this a little bit of nutritional periodization. And it starts with this needs analysis, this nutrition assessment. So always start here. This is the place you want to go. Step number one, always that needs analysis. Don't get caught up in the, I'm a sports nutritionist. The sport is the most important part. The individual is always what matters most. You'll see plenty of questions on the exam from this slide right here. And as a practitioner, great one to just print out, have a picture of, memorize. Remember this one because it'll streamline your process quite a bit. Hope that was helpful. Again, all of our prep, all of our study resources can be found in the description for this video. We'll see you on the next one, that next rapid review.